Hello, welcome to NetDiligence Cyber Risk Virtual Summit. My name is Heather Osborne. I'm the Director of Global Events and Programming here at NetDiligence, a cyber risk assessment and data breach services company. NetDiligence is pleased to present cybersecurity trends in the healthcare industry and offer our thanks to Integreon for supporting this program. For today's webinar, we will be using the ON24 platform, and you should be viewing the ON24 dashboard in your live screen. All participants will be in listen mode only. Today's presentation will last approximately 60 minutes. Panelists will be taking questions throughout the presentation. You can navigate to the questions widget in the upper right-hand corner. Just type in your questions during the presentation and click Submit. If your question is of immediate import or concerns technical problems, you will receive an immediate answer by text. You can also find a widget called Resources, where you can download assets our presenters and sponsors have provided. Just click on the resource and it will be automatically downloaded. If you are seeking CLE credit for today's webcast, please navigate to the CLE box in the lower right-hand corner to make your selection. This will ensure that you are emailed the CLE questionnaire to complete your application for credit. Additionally, please note that you must remain online for the duration of the program and answer the 3 polling questions that appear during the presentation. Thank you again for joining this program today. It is my great pleasure to welcome Jamie Berry, our moderator for today's program. Thank you.
Hi, and thank you, Heather, for that introduction. I wanted to welcome everyone to the NetDiligence Cyber Risk webinar entitled Cybersecurity Trends in the Healthcare Industry. I'm very pleased to be joined today by 2 industry experts in this field, Josh Haas and Lynn Sessions. Just by way of introduction, my name is Jamie Berry. I'll serve as the moderator for this panel. I'm Executive Vice President at Integreon. Integreon is a service provider that provides managed document review and review services for cybersecurity incidents. I'll now kick it over to Josh for an introduction for him.
Thank you, Jamie. Hello, everyone. My name is Josh Haas. I'm a Vice President with Charles River Associates, where I lead the firm's e-discovery and information governance solutions. I have about 15 years of experience helping clients manage issues related to e-discovery, information governance, and cybersecurity. CRA maintains a fantastic group of cybersecurity experts where, on a global basis, we help organizations deal with issues like incident response. And with that, I'll pass it back to Jamie.
Thanks, Josh. Lynn, introduction from you, please.
Thank you. I'm Lynn Sessions. I'm a partner in the Houston office of BakerHostetler. I focus my practice on helping healthcare organizations through data breaches and regulatory responses that follow those data breaches. I've worked with healthcare clients for the 27 years that I've been in law practice. And prior to coming to BakerHostetler, I was an in-house attorney at Texas Children's Hospital. So I've been both on the client side as well as working with clients to help them through incident response.
Thanks, Lynn and Josh. Again, very excited to be a moderator for this panel today. And with the introductions being completed, I'd like to move to our first polling question of the day. Our first polling question is true or false? In 2020, the global healthcare industry is worth over $8 trillion. Please take the time to select your choice. Click the Submit button, and we will proceed. Thank you. Quick rundown on our agenda today, the topics that we will cover. First, we will cover recent industry response trends in the healthcare industry. I think that will set us up very nicely to talk about how do we respond and what's important to remember in responding to incidents inside of the healthcare industry. First, we'll talk about data mining strategies for health information. Next, we'll talk about, after we mine those documents for health information, what do we need to focus on in terms of extracting and reporting on that information? And we'll finish our topic today with a conversation around planning and triggers for notification requirements. Let's focus our topic today on some recent incident response trends in the healthcare industry. We all know if we have been working from home and doing everything that we have been doing over the last 8 months, there is a significant impact not only on the cybersecurity industry, but all of life from the COVID-19 pandemic. First, let me send it over to you, Lynn, with respect to any thoughts you may have on how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected your business in counseling those companies that have been affected by an incident during these challenging times.
Sure. So as I mentioned, I've worked with healthcare clients for the 27 years I've been in practice, and one thing that you find in working with that industry is you've got very, very resilient clients. They're used to dealing with crises that come their way. Just last night, we were dealing with a hurricane here on the Gulf Coast, and I know the hospitals were always very, very prepared, and that would be true with respect to a pandemic. One of the things that we've seen, though, with this particular scenario is the work-from-home environment, the telemedicine environment, and the impact that security incidents may have in that environment. So what we've seen is a lot of non-essential workers at hospitals. So lawyers like myself, when I worked at a hospital, and other office personnel were, of course, sent to work from home as opposed to being on the floors working with patients or in physicians' offices that may have been shut down during this time period. So the impact from that is that, it's new cybersecurity issues that we see may come up. Just like across the country, across the world, when people were sent to work from home, hospitals and other healthcare folks had to address the concern about protected health information being exposed via the internet, multi-factor authentication being put in place as more and more people were moved to work from home. And so the difference that may have with a healthcare organization versus a non-healthcare organization is it could be a data breach. So the risk assessments around telemedicine, for example, so doing more telemedicine type office visits with patients to determine whether or not they even had COVID-19 or if they needed to go in for testing for COVID-19. All of these things were really trending at exactly the same time. So as we saw the country starting to have mandatory work from home orders and other types of shutdowns throughout the country, we saw hospitals and other healthcare facilities having to respond to that for caring for their patients, but also in ensuring that the enterprise continued to work. So that's kind of one thing that we definitely saw. So we saw an impact to how it was that they were conducting business and the cybersecurity risk that came along with that. And of course, we always find that the bad guys take advantage of that. So they see what's going on in the United States and other parts of the world, and they understand that people are going to be working from home. We're having to prop this up very quickly. And so they try to take advantage of any vulnerabilities that may be out there. So we saw a significant uptick starting probably about 2 weeks into the shutdown. And I'm using the term shutdown because that's just kind of a general term of what I think we all were experiencing in the spring. And we saw about 2 weeks after that a real impact in cybersecurity in the healthcare front. So that was probably the first trend we saw. Second trend we saw then too was there was a financial impact on healthcare organizations. Because they were no longer doing elective surgeries, they were really treating, they were holding beds for COVID patients. There was a lot of their census that went way down. A lot of physicians' offices had to close during that time period and couldn't see patients unless they were, kind of primary care physicians. So we saw a significant financial impact on our healthcare facilities, even those that had always done very well financially. The COVID-19 change in the census in their patient mix really impacted their numbers. And so I think the rest of the world was sitting there thinking, oh my goodness, hospitals must be doing really, really well. Physicians' offices must be doing really well financially because they're seeing so many patients. But the patient mix that they were seeing impacted them from the financial standpoint. So as we've been working with our healthcare clients throughout the year, we've definitely seen that impact them. So whether it's attorney's fees or other incident response fees like forensics fees and this kind of thing, is becoming very, very keenly important to them to be able to track those fees because of the impact to the bottom line.
And Lynn, that's such a great point. I mean, from a value perspective, things are certainly changing, and more data is vulnerable in these particular instances. The way in which healthcare providers are providing services, the workflows and the protocols that they're following aren't sort of the normal protocols that they would typically follow but not for the COVID-19 pandemic. And Josh, I'm sure you were seeing more incidents because the bad guys don't take any time off, as you pointed out, Lynn. But Josh, I wonder if you could comment on the rise of ransomware specifically affecting these healthcare industries and why that may be a bit different for the forensic side of the business in dealing with these types of trends and incidents.
Sure. So I'll preface this with, I'm in New York, I'm in the United States, and in our area, things really turned toward a shutdown in early March. And the industry was alerted by a number of cyber threat actors that they were going to basically have a truce with the healthcare industry and that they wouldn't attack necessary services, healthcare providers due to the pandemic. And candidly, 30 days later in April, we saw the greatest spike in ransomware cases. So we're unsure if people let their guard down, if other bad actors saw this as an opportunity to get into the game. But ransomware since April has been on the rise in historically high points compared to previous months and this time last year. Really, the issue at hand is these organizations are desperate. They're under a certain amount of time pressure in that there's potentially lives at risk. The data they have is absolutely so critical that if they can't access it, it can prevent them from providing services. Threat actors know this. They understand the value of this data to the organization, and they take full advantage. And unfortunately, these groups are usually caught in a bad position because historically many healthcare organizations don't have the necessary resources and funding to defend data breaches and cyber attacks. And not only do they maintain a very highly valuable data source, but they're also very vulnerable. And it's really created a perfect storm during this pandemic to expose a number of issues within the healthcare industry.
And Josh, I would just add to that, kind of looking back at what happened in the spring, is really around we've got these organizations that are having to care for patients, and they're having to care for in a heightened sense of alarm right now during COVID. And that's the thing about a healthcare organization, is that it just cannot shut down. They have to continue to operate 24/7, even when the rest of the world might be shut down, and they have to continue to care for patients. So we're seeing that healthcare organizations, in particular hospital systems, are very vulnerable to ransomware attacks and the impact that it may have on them if they're shut down for even a couple of days, and certainly if they're shut down for a week or more. Being able to access electronic medical records, lab studies, x-rays, all of these things are being now kept in electronic format. And again, because the bad guys know that, they know that an organization, even if they said, you know what, I've got incredible backups, I'm going to go ahead and use my backups to get back up and running, that may take 2 weeks to get there if that happens. And then the other thing, too, is because of the types of data that we're seeing in healthcare, it can be very, very unstructured data. It's one thing if we've got an organization that has, if we've got data that's impacted that's in a spreadsheet, or we've got data that's impacted that's in a very defined electronic health record, because we can, kind of recreate that data if needed and notify patients if notification is required under the circumstances, and notify patients based on that data. But what we have found is there's a lot of unstructured data that may be kept in a variety of different places throughout the organization. The other thing, too, that we've seen that's happened in healthcare with respect to ransomware is that, a year ago, when my colleagues that do non-healthcare work they were paying ransoms left and right. Like when there were these ransomware attacks, they were having to pay the ransom. And I was sitting over in my healthcare office just saying, we never pay a ransom, we never pay a ransom, we never pay a ransom. Why was that? Because most of my organizations did not want to negotiate, quote, negotiate with the terrorists. They wanted to go ahead and restore from backups because it would generally take around the same amount of time for them to restore from backups versus paying the ransom. That all changed at the end of last year. And one of the trends we started seeing, particularly in healthcare, was that the bad actor would not only encrypt data, but they would also take data away from the healthcare client. Why does that make a difference? Because if you think about the information that a healthcare provider has on you, that can be very, very sensitive data. And there are regulatory requirements around that, such as that with HIPAA or with other types of regulatory schemes that you may have to respond to with respect to healthcare information. And so having said that, what we have found is that the healthcare organization feels very, very vulnerable in the situation, not only when their when their systems have been completely encrypted and it's going to take them a while to get back up and running, but also two, if their data has been taken, because they understand the value of that information if it was to go public, get posted on the dark web, get put out on Twitter, or whatever the threat actor may decide to do. So my tune started changing at the end of last year when we saw the threat actor starting to take data from my healthcare clients, and we saw a trend then more so for healthcare organizations to have to pay the ransom.
So Lynn, thank you for that. I think that's a great segue as we talk about the value of the information that has been taken from these types of organizations. You know, I think we should turn our attention to how do we then look through that data and mine it for the sensitive data elements. You know, you had mentioned earlier about the rise of telemedicine. That certainly presents a brand new challenge because now we have the introduction of audio files and video files. They can become more prevalent. But Josh, I wondered if you could help us out and talk a bit about, you know, some of the strategies that a firm like CRA uses in order to try to isolate those documents, be it structured or unstructured, and try to isolate the data elements inside of those sets of data that may have been exfiltrated.
Sure. And Lynn brought up a great point on the complexity of the healthcare data. You know, back in the past, if we were just doing a general investigation or this was pretty much any other industry, we could run some targeted searches and ideally come to a pretty much responsive data set. Unfortunately, healthcare data does pose a lot of challenges, not only because it's structured versus unstructured, but you have handwritten notes, you have poorly scanned documents, you have X-rays and image files, and in general, data that contains metadata that does not index well. So that forces a service provider to now be creative on how they identify responsive data. So we still will utilize traditional methods such as keyword searches, using regular expressions. For those who are unfamiliar, regular expression is where you attempt to identify a pattern. So for example, if I'm looking for a social security number, I'll tell the system to look for 3 digits, 2 digits, and 4 digits grouped together within a certain area of a document. But also, more importantly, we've now had to add artificial intelligence and technology-assisted review and other higher touch workflows in an effort to identify this data. Some of those options are modeling, where we can take data from the client that we know contains PHI and build an artificial model around that, where we can categorize and cluster documents within the population. So basically, we use that sample to identify similar documents and group them and categorize them for us. So if we're looking for an intake form, and our client says, well, our intake form is the same across all of our locations, so we're able to leverage that template to find all of the same documents. Additionally, you can use contextual analytics. That's where you can look at a document and say you look 10 words before and 10 words after a keyword, such as social security number. And we do that in an effort to get a greater understanding of potentially responsive documents. because as I've noted earlier, we can't just run keywords. It's really, at times we'll call into question defensibility and just a complete analysis of the data. And the backbone of all of these methods is really sampling, and that's random and targeted. So we'll go in and identify random samples. We'll leverage human reviewers to lay eyes on these documents and tell us whether or not our workflows are defensible and accurate and responsive. And what's great about doing random and targeted sampling is not only can you use them for exclusion, so you're finding outliers or terms that are overly responsive, you can also use them for inclusion, where maybe a keyword partially hit on some type of PHI that normally would have been missed. Now we know to augment our searches to include these types of documents that would have been missed by just purely running search terms across the data set. And finally, when you're dealing with structured data, the challenge is working with the client to ideally get indices and information from their servers so that we can easily compare what's in the system. So for example, we recently had a children's hospital that was involved in a data breach, and they were able to give us their client-based server that had all of the patient names, and we were able to compare the databases we had very quickly against what they had to rapidly identify patients that needed to be notified, opposed to having 200 reviewers working for a month manually clicking through entries in a database.
And Josh, I think you raised such a significant point there. The ability for experts like yourself to understand that treating healthcare data differently than traditional state PII or financial information is really where you can provide a tremendous amount of efficiencies in this entire process. Look, you and Lynn and I all know that at the end of the day, these types of incidents are typically the most costly, and I think that the issues that you raise about what to look for, how to look for it, and how to use these advanced search technologies and these AI algorithms to find the multiple needles in the multiple haystacks is really what you need to look for when you're talking to providers, both on the forensic and the data mining side, the review side, and also counsel who know, Lynn, if I'm correct in putting words in your mouth, who know that it is an open line of communication and a true partnership between providers and clients, because we're constantly trying to find better ways to skin this cat. Would you agree that the partnership strategy, even as early as the data mining piece of these projects, is critically important?
Absolutely, and we've been working with CRA and Integreon for years, and even as we have a new engagement come in, we refine our protocols that we work through with you all. One of the things that I just want to point out, there might be some people on the call when they heard Josh talk about taking essentially a master patient index of a hospital and running that against some unstructured data. What does that do, and why are they doing that? So there was a change in the law, I'll say a change in the law. There was an interpretation by the Office for Civil Rights, which is the enforcers of HIPAA, that came out late last year, in September of last year, through a resolution agreement with a hospital. And what that resolution agreement stood for was basically like, look, if you have identifiable information of an individual that is associated with a hospital or healthcare provider, then unless you can truly overcome that presumption of a breach that it's not identifiable, then the OCR considers that to be a notifiable event. And so what that has done is, in the past, we would be working with folks like Josh, and we'd say, okay, here's our search terms, which he described early on, what to look for. Here's our search terms. This is a general hospital. We're looking for things like diagnoses and treatment and social security numbers and things that would be very specific to patient care. Since that resolution agreement came down late last year, we've had to change our tune a little bit and say, look, we've got to go much broader than that and truly look for patients' names, because if that person is identifiable, and associated with that hospital, the OCR considers that to be a notifiable event. So we've definitely seen a change in the last, now almost year, in how we are approaching this with our partners and how our clients are approaching that with our partners. And when we have those conversations with our clients, they realize the value of that partnership. So it is working to understand because sometimes this is the first time we've worked with an organization. So it's having a better understanding of that healthcare organization, what types of patients that they treat, how big of an organization is it, could we get the master patient index, and we're then working with folks like Josh to say, okay, what's a good strategy for this particular instance? And I can tell you that one of the first times I ran one of the full name searches was with one of Josh's partners on a relatively small organization where we had to run about 200,000 names against several email accounts. That was part of unstructured data. So it's continuing to refine and evolve, and we keep coming to partners like the two of you and saying, how can you make this easier for our clients? How can you make it more cost effective for our clients? How can you make it take less time for our clients? Because under HIPAA, we've got a 60-day clock that's ticking there. So there's a lot of things that factor into that, and some people are willing to take risks in certain areas that others are not. So it's not a one-size-fits-all. In working with folks like the two of you, allow us to refine that for a particular client in a particular circumstance.
Well, thank you for that bringing in. Yeah, please. Go ahead, Josh.
I'm sorry, Jimmy. I would be remiss not to bring this up because I think it's something the three of us deal with regularly and is becoming more popular in the industry. But there are a number of technologies now that have the ability to do what's called entity extraction. And, some of them will say they'll do it automatically, where they have technology that can leverage AI and analytics to scan a data population and extract entities such as first and last name, company names, addresses, and we're beginning to incorporate that into our strategy as well. But I think it's important because many of these technologies have become very popular, and many clients have maybe heard tidbits about them and think it's the end-all, be-all. And I would just note earlier to tack on what I said earlier, and Lynn, in that this isn't the cleanest type of data. And technologies that can do entity extraction or normalization or consolidation, any of the industry buzzwords that we hear on a pretty regular basis, it's really important to take it with a grain of salt and understand that these are all enablers and they can enhance a workflow, but it's critical to leverage organizations like BakerHostetler, like CRA, like Integreon, to really provide these technologies with the defensible skill behind it to know when and how to use it, opposed to just acquiring this tech, running it, and then sending a notification out the door. We've recently run into a few issues, especially within the healthcare industry, where we've had clients take this approach, and they have encountered some issues with the OCR and other state AGs in that they've potentially missed patients or missed people to identify. So I guess I would just say buyer beware on automated entity extraction.
Yeah, Josh, I'm glad you raised that. I couldn't agree more from the perspective of recognizing that there will never be a silver bullet in order to address these issues. Again, Lynn, thank you for the ringing endorsement, but Josh, I think you've hit the nail on the head. Sort of the reason why I led this off with the question to Lynn about partnerships. It is bringing together the experience, that especially folks like us have on this call in terms of how we can apply those advanced technologies, but more specifically, relying on matters that we've worked on inside of the healthcare industry to really fine-tune how we're able to look for this information and then, to your point, Lynn, effectively, efficiently from a cost perspective and from a time perspective, pulling it all together so that clients don't have to worry about issues with those regulators who are looking over it after things are completed. With that, I'd like to move on to our next polling question. The next polling question is another true-false question. In the last quarter of 2019, ransomware attacks on healthcare jumped 350%. So please take a few moments to reflect on that question, select true or false, and hit the submit button. Thank you. Now that we've provided you with some expertise, if you will, or recent trends about how to identify and mine the information that may have been exfiltrated for the healthcare-related significant personal data elements, let's talk a bit about extracting that information. Josh, you made mention on the last topic about how after we can use those search methodologies and after we incorporate some advanced AI solutions, we still need to look at this information to make sure that we are assigning it to the right entity, to the right patient, to the right customer, to the right client, to the right employee. I'd like to kick off this topic with just some points about why having trained review resources really is important to not only providing this information in a timely fashion, but Lynn, to your point about hitting budget certainty. We all know that this information, as we've talked about, is on the rise. These types of incidents are more frequent. So I think it's important to note that whenever you're working with companies to assist you in these types of incidents, you need to make sure that they have folks that are trained on identifying healthcare information. We've talked about it before. The format of this information changes from company to company. I would argue that even when counsel is on the phone with the client like Lynn is, I'm sure, all the time, even though they may think they know what their data looks like, there are oftentimes issues with formatting around patient identification numbers, medical record numbers. All of those things could cause concern and cause delays in the review portion of these engagements. So you must be aware of the gotchas and train staff that are doing the review on these things, whether it's when you're onboarding new resources or in interval training sessions that you can have with your review teams. There are various different processes that need to happen for those large files that Josh and Lynn referred to, whether they're Excels, whether they're PDFs. And certainly in those real-world examples where we've seen medical payment processing companies who have a disparate variety of information and formats, you need to make sure that those training protocols on each and every engagement account for what we call query logs, right? How do we work with outside counsel like BakerHostetler, and how do we then take the type of information and question and answers that we're getting on protocols from outside counsel and translate that back to the data mining provider and the forensic providers so that we can make sure we didn't miss anything. So if we come across a large swath of information that may require the forensic and the e-discovery vendors to go back and research that information or apply new contextual-based AI searches, we need to make sure that the communication lines are open, that counsel is aware of these questions and provide timely answers so that there aren't any critical deadlines that are missed. But Josh, I'll start with you. When you are working with review providers and working with outside counsel, how often do you get those updated bits and pieces of information of what folks are seeing, and then how do you incorporate that back to maybe update the sets of documents that you're promoting for review during these types of incidents?
So that information is critical. It really does drive the quality, budget, turnaround time, every material aspect of a review and giving notification is predicated on those query logs and feedback you're getting from the reviewers. In many instances, we're not looking at a few hundred documents. We're looking at potentially hundreds of thousands or millions. And we'll talk to clients. We work with outside counsel to try and get an image of the data and what's in the data set. But rarely do we come across an instance where the client knows their data perfectly and all the information they give us resonates and there's no gotchas or landmines. So working with a review team that understands what they're looking at. They understand what PII is, what PHI is, the type of data found within the healthcare industry. Where we've seen providers fall down is that they will take, their traditional legal review team and say, great, you're going to do PHI coding now. And it's very difficult. It's a different data set. When you're looking at a 50-page patient binder and it's all medical terms and medical jargon, it's hard to cull through and analyze that data to find the agreed-to data points that you have to extract to give counsel to the client for notification. So a trained eye is critical. And again, the query logs are critical. Where we've seen issues that it's very easy when you're dealing with a client, outside counsel, and potentially multiple service providers for people not to be aligned and not to be on the same page. And the way I leverage the query logs, and candidly, when I work on hundreds of engagements with the both of you, it's fantastic that we get this information on a daily basis, and we come together as a team to review these questions and come up with a unified approach. So what we tend to find is on a daily basis, we'll receive these questions, and then we'll talk to counsel, we'll talk to client, we'll talk to the review provider, and we start now developing an extension of the agreed-to protocols for all these gray areas. Because as you can imagine, when you step through this data, it's nothing but gray areas and landmines. And what's great is once you step through these questions, sorry, go ahead, Jamie.
No, please go ahead, Josh. I thought you were finished. Please finish the thought.
I was just going to say, once you start clearing up these questions, you notice that quality and review speed pick up because now you're eliminating these gray areas in almost real time. And what's great is once you finish the review and everyone has been talking about this query log on a near daily basis, there's an extra level of confidence in that, okay, we're all on the same page. This represents what we agreed to. We captured everything that we had to. And it allows for a more defensible, high-quality work product at the end of the day, because some of these reviews can go on for 2, 3, 4 months. And you can imagine if you find out toward the end you're not aligned, it could be a disaster.
Thanks, Josh. And Lynn, I think that is a fantastic backdrop with some of the pre-planning that we did for this webinar. You came up with a great set of questions that help your teams and hopefully providers like CRA and Integreon, as we're working to build up to the review and the exchange of those query logs. So I'd like to now move to the next topic about notification planning. Again, with that conversation about how to extract that information as a backdrop, maybe we can just set the stage for the types of things that a firm like BakerHostetler is working through as they work with their clients to prepare for these exercises.
So from the legal perspective and the notification perspective, these are the things that we're constantly looking for throughout the investigative stage. So we might partner with forensic firms like CRA. We will also partner with other firms like both CRA and Integreon to do a data mining type thing. But this is the end goal for us. We always tell our clients, and I'll always tell when I'm doing presentations that you should not be ready, you're not ready to notify until you can answer these questions, which is what happened, how did it happen, what data is involved, what are you doing to protect the individual, so whose data was impacted, and what are you doing to prevent this from happening again? So you can see how the legal analysis and the forensic analysis and the data analysis kind of all come together to get us to the point of being able to do notification. So this is what we're consistently looking for. Sometimes we know what happened. Oh, someone clicked on a phishing email. Okay, what actually happened? What was the impact on the entire organization? Does that impact just that one email account? Does it impact multiple email accounts? Are we able to use our forensic partners to tell us what specific emails or attachments were actually accessed by the threat actor? Or do we have to go much, much broader than that? And this is where we get to that next step of what information was involved. And if we're talking about something that is not a discrete data set, working with partners like you becomes just critically important for those of us that work in the healthcare space. I can remember in the early days that I was doing this, which was really not very long ago, but let's probably say 8 or 9 years ago, I was the one that was going through the PST files, charging, lawyer rates to my clients of having to go through one by one by one. I remember at Thanksgiving, the Friday after Thanksgiving several years ago, that I was looking through this very unstructured data. Now, I am a seasoned healthcare attorney. I've been working with healthcare organizations really since I was 16 years old. So I can recognize certain things when it comes to what protected health information is. But by the same token, that was not an efficient use of my time. That was not efficient use for my client when I should be providing them more so with the legal advice that comes out of this. And so we started working with partners like the two of you to be able to do that. It was partly a timing standpoint. It was also a cost standpoint, but it's also an incredible efficiency standpoint that we were able to gain from people who do this day in and day out. And then, kind of the next thing flows from that data. What are you doing to protect the individual? What type of information is involved here? And then finally, what are you doing to prevent it from happening again in the future? That probably goes more to the what happened and how it happened. But you can see by looking at the slide that all of those things that we've talked about today really factor into our ability to even be able to go out and notify affected individuals.
And Lynn, I wondered if you could just expand on one quick thing for me. In addition to what those companies may be doing to prevent it from happening again, how do you work with clients to inform them not just of the critical protected data that may have been exfiltrated, but what type of information feedback do you get from those helping you with the review that could lead to valuable information that those companies may need around information governance, compliance, maybe some crown jewels that would have left the corporation or the healthcare company in addition to the protected health information? How do you work with those providers to help you inform the client of what they could do or what may have other pieces of data that may have left the company?
Yeah, I think that's a great, forensics is immensely helpful for us in these security incidents, as you can imagine. I mean, they are seeing vulnerabilities as they're doing either for the cause of the incident, but also to of the what may have been exfiltrated and any other vulnerabilities they may see during the time of the forensic investigation. So a lot of times we're providing recommendations on that front. But I think more to your point on the information governance front, when we have like an incredibly huge enterprise data warehouse, which is not unusual now in large healthcare organizations where data is king, they use data to help not only from a research perspective in curing illnesses, but also too looking for efficiencies around in ways that they can treat populations of patients in a more efficient and better manner by looking at data across the organization and perhaps how Dr. Jones is treating differently than Dr. Smith, et cetera. So there's a huge amount of data, and there is a I'm going to use this term, and my healthcare colleagues will probably kill me for this, but there's kind of a worship of data in the healthcare space. They realize the true value of that. So what do? They put them all into one place and hope that they've got Fort Knox around it. So it becomes their crown jewels a lot of times, and I hope nobody that I don't want listening to this, hears this, because it truly does become their crown jewels. And then it becomes immensely important for us to say, okay, what types of protections do you have around that? I think clients are consistently shocked at the amount of PHI that's contained in people's email accounts, and those are the types of things that we talk to them about, like, okay, look, we just looked at 10 years worth of data that were contained in this one physician's email account. You know what you could have done that would have been better? You could have a retention policy that only allows email to be retained for 6 months. And so that way, if you have another phishing incident into a physician's account, then you have much less data that you have to go through. Like, you may not have been able to prevent the phishing email, although we talk about that on the forensic side. But if they do happen to get into the account, again, you've just got a lesser amount of data in which you have to go through to analyze. So a lot of this does come out of it. There are many things that, again, general counsel, privacy officer, compliance officer, CEO, whoever it may be, are often shocked at the amount of data that's having to go through. So we work with folks like you guys to say, okay, you went through 7 million lines of data, Josh. I mean, your team went through 7 million lines of data for us. It took several months to do that. at a very sizable cost to the client or to their insurer. But having said that, how can we now coach the client through in ways in which they can have better data hygiene, they can put an information governance piece in place, and we've had more and more larger healthcare organizations come to us and ask us for that governance piece. And I do think that with the amount of data that's being utilized in healthcare today, I think that is definitely the next wave of ways in which healthcare lawyers like myself can help out our clients.
And Josh, from your perspective as the forensic provider on this panel, but also your role at CRA around information governance, how often are you raising those types of things to counsel and to the end clients because you are so intimately involved in the data sets that are being looked at?
We're bringing it up all the time. I mean, it's really the first conversation on, now we're in this position of reacting to an incident, but now how do we proactively prevent this from happening again? And candidly, this goes back to the note I raised earlier, in that a lot of these organizations aren't pulling together the necessary resources to prevent and avoid these types of situations. And I think most likely post-pandemic, we're going to see a bigger effort to address this concern. But really, we go in and we say, hey, exactly what Lynn said. You've had this data for 5 years. Why don't you have a policy in place, or why don't you put a policy in place that says, okay, every 6 months we're going to do a purge? Or, this data has to get encrypted after 6 months, and after a year, it's automatically disposed of. It's a challenge. And I agree, a lot of organizations, and this doesn't just pertain to the healthcare industry, in that data is king, and a lot of organizations have trouble parting ways with their data. And it really does create a number of landmines and legal liabilities that could have been avoided. And I really think a lot of eyes are going to get opened after the next few months, and the uptick in ransomware and the bad publicity and the litigation. You will see organizations now take a proactive approach and really hone in on good housekeeping and defensible information governance procedures. And if I could just add, I know, Jamie, you and I work with Lynn a lot. She has never given me months to do a review or provide a notification list. So I'm going to hold Lynn to that. And that it's usually tomorrow, next week, immediately. So just on that note.
Thanks for calling.
I know.
Thanks for calling.
We do love working with you.
Well, I think, that's certainly a great segue, into why all of this is important and the notification requirements and priorities that these clients have at the end of these incidents. And so, Lynn, we've talked about the sort of timeline in these types of incidents. I agree with Josh. We never get the extra time, whether it's from you or anyone here, but I think it's because we have these incredibly critical notification triggers. So could you walk us through some of the top notification triggers and the types of sensitive information and regulations that these healthcare companies are certainly under the microscope by?
Absolutely. So, the overarching regulation we have here is HIPAA. I mean, I think everybody understands that. Certainly everyone in the healthcare space understands that. And that deals with unsecured protected health information, which surprisingly to most people, that could be as little as a name of a person associated with care that they're getting at that hospital. So just the fact that I'm a patient at a hospital or a doctor, or I'm a member of a health plan, that's enough for it to be protected health information. So that just kind of gives you a sense of how broad that can be: an email address, a telephone number, and certainly any clinical information that a healthcare organization has on an individual. And then the state laws really deals with personal information. So traditionally that has been really centered more so around names plus social security numbers, driver's license numbers, financial accounts information. But we started seeing a larger trend. Now probably about half of the states now have medical information or health information of some type as a trigger for notification. So even if for some reason you're not in the HIPAA space, you may very well be in the state law space if we're dealing with medical type information. And we've definitely seen with the California Consumer Protection Act, so that we've seen definitely, the California Privacy Act, that we've seen a trend towards even broader information being included in the state laws. So, and just this year alone, we've seen, I don't know, maybe 6 states that have increased what triggers notification from a state law perspective. So that definition of PI is definitely expanding, and it's bringing more, what I would say, what has traditionally been very difficult to search type data into even the state law realm. And then you've got the international laws. So a couple of years ago when GDPR came out, that kind of ushered in a pre-CCPA standard in which the much broader language could trigger notification. And along those same lines, each of these things that I'm talking about, HIPAA, we've got a 60-day notification obligation. Some of the state laws have as little as 15 business days, but they may have 30-day notification obligation. And then what my clients who deal with the GDPR, they worry about is there's a 72-hour notice obligation that you may have to a regulator in the EU. So you can see that it's not only the types of information that can be difficult, it's knowing that there's deadlines that are looming out there to your regulator. And so working with partners, and this is why I don't give y'all months to look at this stuff, it's because we're under the gun by the time we ever reach out to you. And we reach out to folks that we know are going to do a good job understanding the deadlines that our clients have and operate within there to get, the quality results that we need to be able to do an appropriate notification to affected individuals.
And that is such an important piece of this, Lynn, is, you reach out to folks like Josh and myself because I think, and again, not to put words in your mouth, but you recognize the power of working relationships, understanding and critical expertise around identifying this stuff. I mean, to Josh's point, we never have enough time to really take our time and to tiptoe through this data, right? You have to rely on your expertise, you have to rely on training, and you have to rely on the open lines of communication between counsel and the forensic firm in order to be able to satisfy the notification triggers that you see on this slide. I'd like to move to our last polling question, if I could. And quick quiz, HIPAA stands for Healthcare Information Privacy Administration Act, Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, Healthcare Investigation and Protection for All Administration, or the quintessential none of the above. Please take some time to make your choice and hit submit. Thank you, Lynn and Josh, for all of your excellent commentary. I think we all recognize how important this topic is, and I'm very thankful to be able to moderate this panel today. We do have some time available for questions and answers. So for those of you that have questions on the topic or any of the topics that you've heard today, please feel free to ask those now, and I'll direct the panelists to provide a response. Thank you very much again for your time.
So let's start with the first question then. This question came in, and I will direct it to Josh Hosh first. Given the detailed information involved in healthcare incidents, have you seen the overall process, remediation through notification, take longer than standard PII incidents? And Josh, I think back to a lot of the things we've said already today about the complexity of the healthcare data, how it sometimes deals with handwritten notes or poorly scanned documents and x-rays, and how these types of projects could take 2, 3, 4 months to review all of that information. Can you maybe just provide a couple of minutes on whether or not these are more lengthy projects than those typical standard PII incidents?
Thanks, Jimmy. Yeah, we're usually seeing that the PHI work takes longer than PII or for that matter, any other type of privacy review we do. A lot of what drives that are the PHI protocols. We didn't discuss that much on this session, but basically client, counsel, and service provider come together to decide basically the rules of engagement along the lines of what has to be extracted, how documents should be reviewed. And we typically find if you're doing a PII matter, you could be looking for, say, 10 to 15 elements to extract. And an element can be a driver's license, a passport number, versus a PHI matter where you could potentially be looking for north of 30 items. Everything ranging from biometrics to x-rays to different forms of medical information, and really just the complexity of going through these large documents and pinpointing these elements typically leads to PHI taking much longer than PII.
And Lynn, when you hear from CRA or you hear from Integreon after we talked about those standard sort of rules of engagement that Josh indicated, how do you have those difficult conversations with your healthcare clients about why these types of projects, whether it's data mining or the investigation to extract client patient information, why it's taking so long and why the costs are higher than a standard PII incident?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and you're right, they can be really difficult conversations. So interestingly, for most of my clients, the cost is kind of borne out at the beginning, right? So we get a quote from you guys about what the cost is going to look like based on the volume of data. I think the harder, and that's either borne by them or their insurance company. The harder question really does become the timing piece of it, because as I alluded to earlier, you know, we've got a 60-day clock that's ticking, and to be able to complete these reviews with massive amounts of data can certainly take longer than even 60 days. So if the client comes to me on day one, that may not even be enough time to get through. So we talk to them about various strategies that we employ based on where we are in the data review, what information is available on the 60th day, what their preferences from both a business and communication standpoint. And these are things that have not been openly sanctioned by the Office for Civil Rights, but we feel like it puts them into the best possible position going in with clean hands should they have to explain to the OCR why this took so long. And we got a question during the session about, you know, why don't you just notify everybody, because these data reviews can be costly and they can take a long period of time. That's going to depend on the organization. And so, you know, if you've got an organization that has just 10,000 patients, then that might be the answer to the question. If you've got another organization that has 10 million patients, which some of our large healthcare providers do, then that's a really, really different conversation to have, because to notify 10 million people, not knowing that 10 million people are impacted by that, is not only also costly, but also could have a significant legal impact on the healthcare organization. So we have those really hard conversations with them about, hey, these are your choices. You're between a rock and a hard place. These are strategies we've done in the past, and these are the pros and cons of those various strategies.
Lynn, thank you for that answer. Josh, also thank you. Last question, Lynn, I'll give it to you. This came in earlier. What factors determine whether an organization pays a ransom?
So there's a lot of things that go into that ransomware, the payment of the ransom question. Some of it is the organization's desire to negotiate with criminals. Some are very steadfast in not being willing to do that. Others will say, do we have appropriate backups? How quickly can we get back up and running by using those backups? Sometimes the backups are also encrypted depending on how the organization is structured. So there's that will go into it. The cost of the actual ransom payment. I mean, how much will it cost you to pay the ransom? And do you have either that amount of money, or do you have the insurance coverage to pay for that? So some of it's philosophical, some of it's very practical, the questions that go into that. A lot of times we have recently found our healthcare organizations in a position to say we need to pay the ransom, either because we can't restore from backup, or the threat actor has our data and is threatening to publish it on the dark web if we don't pay them the ransom, and we feel like that's going to put our patients into a worse off position. So I can't say there's a one-size-fits-all. There's a variety of things that go into it. A lot of it may be driven by some business factors or philosophical factors within the healthcare organization itself.
Thank you for that answer, Lynn. There are a few other questions that, unfortunately, we don't have time to answer today. We'll be working with the folks at Net Diligence to provide answers to all questions that were asked. Again, wanted to thank Net Diligence for setting this webinar up. Also wanted to thank my fellow panelists, Lynn Sessions from Baker and Josh Haas from CRA. Thank you all very much for your attentiveness, for your time. Stay well and stay safe. Thank you.